Imagine sitting in your own living room, drinking coffee you bought, when your mother-in-law pushes a lease agreement across the table. She demands $4,000 a month to breathe the air inside a house legally titled in your name. Instead of throwing her out, I smiled, picked up a pen, and paid her. Because sometimes the absolute best way to destroy a parasite is letting it feast until it explodes. Hello, everyone. Before today's story begins, we'd like to share a quick message. YouTube recently removed our monetization, cutting off our income. If you enjoy this story, we humbly ask for just $1 to help pay our staff so they can make a living and keep creating for you. Thank you for saving us. Now, let's begin the story. My name is Caroline Hamilton. I am 34 years old and work as the lead architect for Meridian Horizon Developments. Long before I ever met my husband, Julian, I secured my own slice of paradise. I purchased a stunning historic Victorian mansion located right on the coast of Galveston, Texas. It was a massive undertaking, but I poured my heart, my soul, and a significant portion of my early career bonuses into restoring the property to its former glory. The architecture is breathtaking, featuring intricate mahogany woodwork, sweeping double staircases, original stained glass windows, and a massive wraparound porch that lets in the salty Gulf breeze every single morning. My career at the firm is incredibly demanding. Overseeing multi-million-dollar commercial development projects requires my constant and undivided attention, and the daily pressure is relentless. I manage teams of contractors, navigate complex zoning laws, and negotiate with aggressive investors. That is exactly why my home in Galveston became my absolute sanctuary. After enduring 80-hour work weeks filled with endless shouting matches and chaotic construction sites, stepping through those heavy oak front doors felt like taking my first real breath in days. The quiet, refined elegance of the space, the carefully curated modern art pieces, and the meticulously designed open layout were my physical and mental shields against the cutthroat corporate world outside. It was my private haven, untouched, silent, and entirely mine. When Julian and I started getting serious about our future together, I made a highly calculated decision regarding my personal finances. In my line of work, I had seen too many successful, brilliant women lose everything they had built to messy divorces or opportunistic, greedy partners. I loved Julian, but I valued my financial security above all else. So, I fabricated a completely bulletproof financial cover story. I told Julian that the sprawling property was actually owned by a wealthy corporate trust associated with the board of directors at Meridian Horizon Developments. I explained that, because of my senior executive status, the trust permitted me to live in the mansion for a heavily discounted employee rate of just $2,000 a month. Julian, who never possessed much financial literacy or ambition, accepted this elaborate explanation without asking a single follow-up question. He simply believed we were exceptionally lucky to live in such a magnificent home for mere pennies. Our peaceful, quiet existence shattered completely when Julian's parents, Eleanor and Arthur, faced a sudden and catastrophic financial ruin. Arthur had always arrogantly fancied himself a brilliant, forward-thinking investor, constantly looking down on traditional careers. However, his latest obsession with highly volatile cryptocurrency projects ended in absolute disaster. Within a matter of mere weeks, the market crashed, and they lost their entire life savings. They were unceremoniously evicted from their luxury downtown condo, bankrupt, humiliated, and desperate. They had nowhere else to turn. Julian spent 3 hours begging me to let them stay with us in Galveston until they could get back on their feet. Against my better judgment, and genuinely wanting to be a supportive wife during a crisis, I agreed to give them temporary refuge in my sacred sanctuary. The exact moment Eleanor dragged her scuffed, overstuffed suitcases across my pristine, hand-polished hardwood floors, the invasion began. She did not express a single ounce of gratitude or relief for having a roof over her head. Instead, she immediately began critiquing every single detail in sight. She loudly scoffed at the expensive, minimalist aesthetic I had spent years cultivating. Within 48 hours of arriving, She started taking down my valuable abstract gallery paintings and replacing them with cheap, mass-produced floral prints she bought from a local discount store. She draped tacky, brightly colored, ruffled throws over my custom Italian leather sofas and pushed my curated dining room furniture against the walls to accommodate her massive collection of ceramic animal figurines. When I firmly confronted her about touching my belongings, she simply waved her hand dismissively. She stated that the corporate trust would not care about a little redecorating and boldly claimed that the cold, sterile house desperately needed a real mother's touch to feel like a proper home. I naturally expected Julian to intervene, set firm boundaries, and remind his mother that she was a guest. Instead, he took her side completely and without hesitation. When I expressed my deep frustration over the blatant disrespect of my personal space, Julian turned the entire argument against me. He stood in the middle of my custom marble kitchen, his voice dripping with absolute condescension and misplaced anger. "Caroline, you are being incredibly selfish right now," he said, glaring at me as if I were the enemy. "My parents just lost everything they worked for. They are traumatized and grieving, and you are obsessing over some stupid minimalist paintings and a leather couch. Have some basic human compassion for my family's financial crisis, instead of acting like a heartless corporate drone who only cares about aesthetics." I stood completely still and stared at the man I had married, feeling a cold, hard knot form deep in my stomach. He was aggressively defending the very people who were systematically destroying my peace, and he was using my supposed lack of ownership of the house as a weapon to silence me. He truly believed he had the absolute right to dictate what happened inside the mansion, because he thought I was merely a lucky renter with no real authority. That specific moment marked the definitive beginning of his cruel, unforgivable betrayal. The peaceful sanctuary I had built was actively being dismantled from the inside, and the man who was supposed to be my equal partner was cheerfully handing his parents the sledgehammer. I did not raise my voice, I did not cry, and I did not argue back. Instead, I quietly retreated to my upstairs study, fully realizing that the protective financial wall I had built around my assets was no longer just a cautious precaution. It was about to become my deadliest weapon. The morning sun had barely begun to illuminate the kitchen when I walked downstairs to brew my coffee. I found Eleanor leaning against the marble island, completely blocking my path to the espresso machine. She held a thick manila folder pressed against her chest, wearing an expression of smug authority that felt entirely out of place in my home. Before I could even ask her to move, she slapped a stack of stapled papers onto the countertop and slid them toward me. "Arthur and I have been making some major decisions regarding the living arrangements," Eleanor announced, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "We realized how heavily burdened you must be with your stressful job, so we took the initiative to contact the board of directors at Meridian Horizon Developments. We negotiated a brand new master lease for the entire property." I stared at the crookedly printed document. It was a laughable forgery, featuring a heavily pixelated version of my company logo pasted at the top and legally nonsensical jargon filling the paragraphs. They had actually typed out a fraudulent sublease agreement. "Since Arthur and I are now the official property managers for the corporate trust," Eleanor continued, crossing her arms defensively, "we have restructured the rental agreement. If you wish to continue occupying the primary suite upstairs, your new monthly payment will be $4,000. It is a completely fair market rate considering the square footage and our extensive management services." My analytical mind immediately dissected the sheer absurdity of her claim. My corporate firm did not own this property. There was no board of directors managing the estate, and it was legally impossible for Arthur to have negotiated anything. Yet, here she stood, brazenly attempting to extort me under the roof I owned. Just as I picked up the fraudulent document to examine the fake signatures, Julian strolled into the kitchen. He poured himself a glass of orange juice and stood shoulder to shoulder with his mother, projecting a united front. "Do not give my mother a hard time about this, Caroline," Julian said smoothly. "My parents are taking on a huge responsibility by managing this massive estate so you can focus on your career. I have already agreed to the new terms and transferred my half of the rent. I gave them $2,000 this morning. You need to step up and pay your fair share of the remaining $4,000. I looked at Julian, processing his absolute betrayal. His claim of paying $2,000 was a glaring confession. Julian had been unemployed for 6 months, meaning the money he supposedly transferred came directly from our joint savings account, an account funded entirely by my architectural bonuses. He was actively draining my hard-earned money to subsidize his parents' luxurious, parasitic lifestyle, ensuring they never had to find jobs while simultaneously trying to force me to pay an exorbitant fee just to sleep in my own bedroom. He was treating my finances like an endless well to keep his family comfortable. The overwhelming urge to march upstairs, retrieve the heavy, legally binding property deed from my fireproof safe, and slam it onto the kitchen island was almost intoxicating. I wanted to watch their smug faces crumble as they realized I was the sole legal owner of the multi-million-dollar estate. I wanted to throw them out onto the street right then and there, but my years of corporate litigation training immediately kicked in, replacing my burning rage with cold, calculated restraint. If I threw them out now, it would just be a petty domestic dispute, but what they were attempting right now, producing a forged corporate document to extract money across state bank lines, was a severe crime. I understand, I said softly, keeping my facial expression completely neutral. I will handle the payment immediately. Julian smirked, clearly mistaking my silence for submission, and patted his mother on the back. They walked out of the kitchen, whispering excitedly to each other like victorious thieves. Instead of heading to the office, I locked the door to my study and opened my secure laptop. I did not log into our joint bank account. Instead, I accessed a private, separate financial institution and opened a brand new checking account under my name alone. I deposited the initial $4,000. Then, I initiated a direct wire transfer to the account number Eleanor had explicitly listed on her fake lease. I made absolutely certain to fill out the transaction memo field with excruciating detail. I typed that the $4,000 was for the monthly rent, property tax contribution, and estate management fees for the specific Galveston address. Fulfilling the corporate sublease terms, I wanted an undeniable paper trail proving exactly why this money was changing hands. Next, I opened a new encrypted spreadsheet. I labeled it as my digital ledger. I meticulously logged the date, the exact time of the transaction, the routing numbers, and the corresponding fake lease clauses. I knew the federal guidelines regarding grand larceny and wire fraud by heart. A few $1,000s might only result in a slap on the wrist, but if I let this parasitic arrangement continue for a few months, the stolen amount would easily cross the federal felony threshold. I was not just going to evict them, I was going to let them greedily consume my money until they accumulated enough criminal evidence to guarantee a devastating, inescapable federal prosecution. The situation escalated from a quiet, parasitic invasion into an active demolition zone faster than I could have ever anticipated. I returned home from the firm on a stormy Wednesday evening to find a massive commercial moving truck parked recklessly across my manicured front lawn, its heavy tires sinking deep into the wet grass. Julian's younger sister, Beatrice, was standing in the pouring rain, aggressively barking orders at a group of men wearing dirty work boots and carrying heavy demolition equipment, without a single word of discussion, warning, or a shred of permission. Beatrice had decided to permanently occupy the detached 2-story guest house located at the rear of my estate. She loudly announced to anyone who would listen that she was launching an exclusive luxury holistic wellness center and spiritual retreat. She claimed the oceanfront energy was absolutely perfect for her wealthy future clientele. The destruction happened at lightning speed, plunging my once peaceful sanctuary into total chaos. Beatrice refused to hire actual professionals. Instead, she brought in cheap, completely unlicensed day laborers who treated my historic, meticulously restored property like a worthless scrapyard. The agonizing sounds of grinding metal and smashing wood echoed through the courtyard all day long. When I finally forced my way past the chaotic work zone to inspect the progress, a wave of physical sickness washed over me. The reckless crew had aggressively dragged heavy iron hydrotherapy tubs and massive stone saunas right through the main hallway. In doing so, they had gouged deep, jagged, irreparable trenches straight through the lower tiers of the original, hand-carved mahogany staircase. It was a piece of architectural history that could never be genuinely replaced. Worse still, I heard an unnatural hissing sound coming from the walls. I looked up to see dirty water steadily dripping from the ornate plaster ceiling in the formal dining room. Her amateur contractors had recklessly drilled blindly into the structural cavities and haphazardly tied their makeshift spa equipment directly into my main water lines. They had completely ruptured the highly expensive, custom pressurized plumbing system I had installed 3 years prior. The immediate visual assessment indicated tens of thousands of dollars in catastrophic structural and water damage. I immediately marched into the living room and confronted Julian, demanding an explanation for the absolute devastation occurring on the property. I laid out the financial reality of the destruction, pointing out that the water damage alone would require gutting the entire east wing to prevent toxic mold. Julian did not even flinch. He slowly set down his tablet, leaned back in his armchair, and looked at me with an expression of profound boredom. "You are being completely paranoid and incredibly bitter." "Caroline," Julian sighed, shaking his head as if he were speaking to an irrational child. "Beatrice is a visionary. She is building a highly lucrative brand, and a few little scuffs on the wood or a minor leak are just the normal costs of doing business. You are just jealous because she actually has the courage to be an entrepreneur, while you are stuck slaving away for a corporate boss. You should be supporting her immense talent instead of acting like a jealous, dramatic landlord." His brazen manipulation and absurd gaslighting triggered a terrifying realization in my mind. Beatrice had no job, no savings, and terrible credit. Unlicensed contractors still demanded cash up front. I turned on my heel, locked myself inside my private study, and immediately opened my laptop. My hands were remarkably steady as I bypassed my personal accounts and logged directly into the primary joint savings account I shared with Julian. This was the account where I had faithfully deposited a massive portion of my executive bonuses for the last 4 years, intending to use it as our future safety net. The bold black numbers staring back at me from the bright screen made the room spin. The balance was exactly $0.00. My eyes darted down to the transaction history. Page after page of massive wire transfers painted a horrifying picture of financial slaughter. Julian had ruthlessly drained every single penny I had earned. There were multiple withdrawals of $20,000 and $30,000, sent directly to a newly formed business entity registered in Beatrice's name. But the betrayal did not stop there. The largest transaction, a staggering lump sum removed just 2 days prior, was wired directly to an elite luxury auto dealership in Houston. He had not only bankrolled his sister's illegal demolition project, but he had also purchased a brand-new, high-performance sports car for Eleanor to parade around town. He had stolen hundreds of thousands of dollars from my sweat and labor to crown himself the generous king of his parasitic family. I did not scream. I did not throw my coffee mug against the wall. The cold, calculating corporate strategist inside me took absolute control, freezing my emotions entirely. I opened a new browser tab and accessed the highly secure employee payroll portal for Meridian Horizon Developments. I clicked on my direct deposit settings. With a few deliberate keystrokes, I deleted the routing numbers for every domestic bank account attached to my name or Julian's name. I then entered the complex routing information for a highly secure, private offshore financial institution I had quietly established years ago for international consulting. I clicked confirm, effective immediately. 100% of my massive corporate salary, my quarterly executive bonuses, and my stock dividends were permanently diverted overseas. I severed the financial artery completely and silently. They were currently living in a fantasy world built on stolen money, but the well had just run completely dry, and they had absolutely no idea that their financial oxygen had just been permanently cut off. The atmosphere inside the mansion shifted drastically by the second week of the month. Julian's smug, triumphant demeanor evaporated entirely, replaced by a frantic, erratic hostility. He would pace the long hallways late into the night, aggressively refreshing mobile banking applications on his phone and muttering furiously under his breath. When my usual massive bi-weekly executive direct deposit failed to hit our joint account, he practically ambushed me near the front foyer. His eyes were bloodshot, and his tone was sharply accusatory. "Where is your paycheck, Caroline?" Julian demanded, blocking my path to the door. "The account is completely empty. Did the firm slash your salary? Are you underperforming on the new high-rise project?" I looked him dead in the eye and smoothly lied, stating that the corporation was undergoing a massive financial restructuring and all executive payouts were temporarily frozen for a minimum of 60 days. Instead of offering a single word of support or asking how I was coping with the stress, he immediately began pressuring me. He demanded I beg the partners for a cash advance, take on exhausting freelance consulting gigs, and work straight through the weekends to ensure the cash flow remained uninterrupted. His palpable desperation exposed the pathetic reality that their entire luxurious, parasitic ecosystem was violently collapsing without my fresh, hard-earned funds. I knew their mounting financial panic would inevitably force them into a desperate corner, and I needed to know exactly what their next illegal move would be. On a Tuesday morning, I packed a small suitcase and announced I had been assigned an emergency, mandatory site inspection in Dallas that would keep me away for at least 3 days. Eleanor practically shoved me out the front door, her eyes gleaming with the greedy prospect of having the entire estate to themselves. But I did not drive to Dallas. Before leaving the house, I had meticulously attached a highly sensitive, voice-activated micro-audio recorder directly underneath the thick center pedestal of the massive mahogany dining table. It was the exact spot where they gathered every single evening to drink my expensive wine and plot their next demands. I simply drove 2 towns over, checked into a cheap, anonymous roadside motel under a fake name, and waited patiently. 48 hours later, I quietly slipped back into the estate while they were out shopping at a luxury boutique. I retrieved the tiny black device and brought it back to my dimly lit motel room. I plugged it into my laptop, put on my heavy, noise-canceling headphones, and hit play. What I expected to hear was standard complaining or perhaps a petty scheme to pawn my valuable jewelry. What I actually heard made my blood run entirely cold. The audio quality was terrifyingly crisp. Arthur's voice trembled with genuine, raw terror as he paced heavily around the dining room floor. Through the recording, I learned the horrifying truth that his supposed cryptocurrency failure was merely a convenient, palatable lie designed to gain my sympathy. Arthur was not just a terrible, arrogant investor. He was a degenerate, out-of-control gambler. "They are going to kill me, Eleanor," Arthur sobbed on the recording, his voice cracking. "I owe $500,000 to the syndicate in Houston. The bookies are not taking my calls anymore. They said if I do not have the cash in 14 days, they are sending armed enforcers to break my legs." The voices on the recording grew hushed and frantic. Eleanor began crying, but not out of remorse for the danger her husband had brought to my doorstep. She was crying out of sheer terror for her own safety. That was when Arthur presented his unimaginably reckless, criminal solution. He proposed they use my historic Galveston mansion as collateral for a high-interest, black-market loan from a shadow lender deeply connected to the criminal underworld. "We cannot do that, Arthur," Eleanor whispered sharply. "The corporate trust owns the house. We do not have the paperwork." Then, Arthur laughed a sick, desperate laugh that sent shivers down my spine. "There is no corporate trust," Arthur replied maliciously. "I spent all day yesterday prying open the locked drawers in Caroline's private study. I found the real, original property deed. She owns this entire estate outright. Her name is the only one on the title. All we have to do is forge a duplicate deed transferring the equity to me, and the shadow lender will advance us the $500,000 by Friday." I sat completely frozen in my uncomfortable motel chair, desperately waiting for Julian to scream, to defend me, to draw a hard line at federal forgery and mob involvement. Instead, I heard my husband pour himself a heavy drink. The clinking of ice against the crystal glass echoed loudly through my headphones. The shadow lender will require Caroline's physical signature on the federal loan applications and a spousal consent form to finalize the illegal lien, Julian said calmly, his voice completely devoid of emotion or guilt. Do not worry about it. Dad, I have spent years watching her sign massive architectural blueprints. I can forge her exact signature flawlessly. We will get the money. My husband was not just a lazy, entitled enabler. He was an active, willing, and eager participant in a massive federal fraud scheme designed to hand my life's work over to violent, organized criminals. The brutal reality of the situation hit me with the destructive force of a freight train. This was no longer just a messy domestic dispute over stolen savings or a battle against annoying, entitled in-laws. This was a highly dangerous, rapidly escalating criminal conspiracy. If Arthur succeeded in finalizing that illegal loan, violent mob debt collectors would soon be kicking down my custom oak doors, claiming legal, binding rights to my historic sanctuary. I could no longer afford to play the long game of quietly collecting wire fraud evidence for a distant, eventual prosecution. The timeline had violently accelerated. I had to strike immediately, surgically, and with absolute, devastating legal force before the Houston crime syndicate sank its venomous claws into my property and my life. I did not return to the mansion the following morning. Instead, I drove straight from my dreary motel room to the towering glass skyscrapers of downtown Houston. I walked into the corner office of my retained corporate litigation attorney, a ruthless legal predator named Marcus, who handled my firm's most vicious contract disputes. I placed a heavy, encrypted flash drive onto his massive glass desk. It contained every single piece of evidence I had meticulously gathered over the past few weeks. It held the digital ledger of the extortion payments, the completely fraudulent sublease agreement Eleanor had presented to me, the bank statements proving Julian drained our joint funds, and the crystal-clear audio recording of them conspiring to commit federal wire fraud and forge my signature for a mob-backed loan. Marcus listened to the entire audio file in absolute silence. When the recording finished, a cold, predatory smile spread across his sharply angled face. He did not waste a single second. He immediately mobilized his entire legal team, pulling 3 junior partners off their current cases to focus entirely on my situation. Within 4 hours, they had drafted a staggering arsenal of destructive legal documents. First, they secured an emergency ex parte restraining order, freezing every single bank account associated with Julian, Arthur, and Beatrice, effectively paralyzing their ability to move any of the stolen money or secure outside counsel. Second, Marcus prepared formal criminal referrals addressed to the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the local district attorney, detailing the active conspiracy to commit mortgage fraud and grand larceny. Third, he printed immediate, unappealable eviction notices for every unauthorized occupant currently residing on my property. Finally, Marcus handed me a thick, violently aggressive divorce petition that sought full restitution of all stolen marital funds, permanent protective orders, and absolute denial of any spousal support. The trap was absolutely flawless, completely airtight, and legally lethal. I instructed Marcus to hold the documents and await my exact signal. When I finally returned to Galveston late Friday afternoon, I discovered that Eleanor's delusions of grandeur had reached an entirely new level of absurdity. In a desperate, manic bid to cement her fake status among the local high society before Arthur's criminal deadline arrived, she had organized a massive, lavish charity gala right in my backyard. Caterers were setting up enormous white tents on the manicured lawn, valets were organizing parking barricades along the driveway, and florists were hauling in thousands of dollars worth of imported white orchids to drape over my balconies. She had boldly invited the absolute wealthiest elites of the city, entirely funding the extravagant affair with the last remnants of stolen cash she thought they had, all to show off the magnificent estate she claimed to manage. Instead of shutting the ridiculous event down, I saw the perfect stage for their absolute destruction. I decided to lean heavily into the pathetic role they had arrogantly assigned to me. when the first wave of diamond-clad guests arrived at 7 o'clock that evening. I did not dress in my usual designer evening wear. I wore a plain, unassuming black dress and silently blended into the background of the catering staff. I spent the next 2 hours walking quietly through the glittering crowd, picking up discarded champagne flutes and wiping down cocktail tables like a lowly, desperate tenant working off her rent. Eleanor noticed my subservient behavior and absolutely reveled in it. She went out of her way to loudly introduce me to the wives of local politicians and wealthy oil tycoons, introducing me not as her daughter-in-law or a highly successful corporate architect, but as the struggling, unfortunate girl who rented a spare bedroom upstairs. She loudly mocked my simple clothing and told the entire room how incredibly generous she and Arthur were for allowing me to stay on the property out of the goodness of their benevolent hearts. I simply nodded politely, kept my eyes lowered to the floor, and continued collecting dirty napkins. The sheer arrogance radiating from her was blinding, entirely masking the heavy legal guillotine hanging directly over her neck. She was digging her own social grave in front of the exact people she desperately wanted to impress. As the evening reached its glittering peak, the string quartet stopped playing, and the massive crowd gathered around the grand mahogany staircase. Julian stepped up to the polished landing, holding a crystal glass, looking every inch the wealthy, successful heir he pretended to be. He tapped his glass with a silver spoon, demanding the undivided attention of the 200 wealthy guests packing my living room. "I want to thank all of you for coming to our beautiful home tonight," Julian began, his voice thick with rehearsed, fake emotion. He looked down at Arthur and Eleanor, pressing a hand over his heart. "I especially want to thank my incredible parents. When I was struggling to find my path in life, they selflessly purchased this breathtaking historic estate and gifted it to me so I could build my future. They are the true pillars of this community, and this house stands as a permanent monument to their endless generosity and love." He completely erased my existence. He stood inside the architectural masterpiece I had bled to restore, claiming it as his own accomplishment while portraying his parasitic, criminal parents as local saviors. The crowd erupted into warm, polite applause, completely mesmerized by the fabricated fairy tale. I stood in the shadows near the grand entryway, perfectly still, watching the sickening display of unearned triumph. I slowly pulled my phone from my pocket. I opened my secure message thread with Marcus. The text was already typed out and waiting on the screen. It consisted of a single, definitive word: execute. I pressed send. The legal strike team, accompanied by local law enforcement, was already positioned just down the street, waiting in the darkness for this exact moment. The applause for Julian was deafening, a sickening symphony of unearned admiration. He stood on the landing of my hand-carved mahogany staircase, bathing in the adoration of the wealthiest elite in Galveston. I placed the silver tray of empty champagne flutes onto a nearby catering table. It was time. I reached into the pocket of my simple black dress and retrieved my smartphone. Earlier that afternoon, I had effortlessly hacked into the wireless network of the massive digital projector Eleanor had rented to display her fabricated charity logos. I stepped out of the shadows and walked directly up the center steps. The string quartet had stopped playing. The room was perfectly silent, hanging on every single word Julian spoke. I bypassed him completely. Stepping up to the microphone stand he was using, he glared at me, his eyes flashing with brief, confused anger, silently demanding I return to my role as the lowly servant. Instead, I grabbed the microphone. I tapped the screen of my phone. Instantly, the glowing charity logo on the massive 20-foot wall behind us vanished. In its place, brightly illuminating the entire grand foyer, was a high-resolution scan of the original property deed. "Good evening, ladies and gentlemen." I spoke into the microphone, my voice steady, cold, and echoing across the marble floors. "I apologize for interrupting my husband's incredibly moving, completely fabricated speech, but since we are all gathered here to celebrate transparency and generosity, I thought it was only right to share the actual truth about this estate." I pointed to the massive projection. This is the legal title to this historic Victorian mansion. If you look closely at the sole ownership line, you will not see the name of a corporate trust, nor will you see the names of Eleanor or Arthur Sutherland. You will only see my name. I bought this property. I restored it, and I own it entirely. The crowd of 200 elites fell into a stunned, breathless silence. I pressed my phone screen again. The projection shifted. It now displayed the horribly forged lease agreement Eleanor had tried to force upon me, placed right next to the bank wire receipts proving I had paid them $4,000. My in-laws did not buy this house to gift to their son, I continued, projecting my voice so every single wealthy investor and local politician could hear the absolute pathetic reality. They went completely bankrupt after squandering their life savings on terrible investments. They were evicted. I took them in out of the kindness of my heart. In return, they forged this fake corporate lease, demanded $4,000 a month in rent for me to sleep in my own bedroom, and used my stolen money to fund this very party. Gasps erupted from the crowd, the wives of the local oil tycoons and banking executives. Women Eleanor had spent the entire evening kissing up to, literally took a step back in sheer disgust. But I was not finished. I clicked to the final, most devastating slide. It displayed a massive transcript of the audio recording I had captured, highlighting Arthur's confession about his massive debt to the illegal gambling syndicate in Houston. But petty extortion was not enough, I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous, razor-sharp tone. Arthur currently owes $500,000 to a violent, organized crime syndicate to pay off his illegal gambling debts. He and my husband, Julian, actively conspired to forge my federal signature to take out a black market loan against my property. Julian's carefully constructed mask of the wealthy, benevolent heir completely shattered. His face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. His secret was out, his cash flow was dead, and his social standing was permanently incinerated in front of the most powerful people in the city. He let out a furious, animalistic scream and violently lunged across the stairs, aiming his hands directly for my throat. He never even made it past the first step. The two broad-shouldered men in catering uniforms who had been quietly pouring wine near the banister were not waiters. They were elite, highly trained private security contractors I had hired specifically for this moment. As Julian lunged, they instantly dropped their bottles, intercepted him with terrifying speed, and slammed him brutally face-first into the hard mahogany floor. They twisted his arms viciously behind his back, locking him down using absolute, overwhelming physical force. Right at that exact second, the heavy front doors of the mansion were pushed wide open. The flashing red and blue lights of multiple police cruisers illuminated the driveway. 3 court-appointed process servers marched into the foyer, flanked closely by 4 armed, uniformed police officers. They parted the sea of terrified socialites and marched directly toward the staircase. The lead server looked down at Arthur, who was physically shaking with terror. He slammed a thick manila envelope against Arthur's chest. "Arthur Sutherland, you are hereby served with a federal indictment for conspiracy to commit wire fraud and attempted mortgage fraud. You are under arrest." The second server turned to Eleanor, who was hyperventilating, her eyes rolling back in shock. He dropped a heavy stack of legal documents right at her expensive heels. "Eleanor Sutherland, you have exactly 10 minutes to vacate these premises under a court-ordered emergency eviction. You are also served with an immediate restraining order prohibiting you from coming within 500 feet of Caroline Hamilton or this property." The third server knelt beside Julian, who was still pinned to the floor by my security guards, spitting and cursing. The server slid a dense legal folder into Julian's jacket pocket. "Julian Sutherland, you are served with a formal petition for divorce, an asset freezing order, and a summons for grand larceny." The reaction from the high society guests was immediate and utterly merciless. These were people who protected their wealth and reputations fiercely. Being in the same room as federal fraud, mob debts, and an active police raid was a toxic social disease they wanted no part of. The mayor's wife scoffed loudly, hiking up her expensive gown, and marched straight for the door. The rest of the crowd followed instantly, a stampede of the wealthy rushing to escape the suffocating stench of the Sutherland family's failures. They abandoned their expensive drinks, completely ignoring Eleanor's pathetic, sobbing pleas for someone to help her. They left the family standing completely isolated in the ruins of their pathetic, fabricated empire. The police officers hauled Arthur to his feet, forcefully clicking heavy steel handcuffs around his wrists. They did the same to Julian, dragging my treacherous, screaming husband up from the floor. I did not offer them a single parting word. They did not deserve my voice. I simply turned my back on them, gracefully ascending the rest of the stairs, and walked straight through my bedroom doors, out onto the sweeping second-floor balcony. I stood in the cool, salty night air, looking down at the driveway. I watched with supreme, undisturbed satisfaction as the police officers shoved Arthur and Julian into the back of separate squad cars. The doors slammed shut with a heavy, final thud. I watched Beatrice and Eleanor, stripped of their fake luxury, being escorted by the process servers past the grand iron gates, forced to drag their cheap suitcases down the dark, empty coastal highway on foot. The police sirens wailed, growing fainter as they drove away, finally leaving my property in absolute, perfect silence. I walked over to the patio table, picked up a bottle of incredibly rare, vintage champagne I had saved for a special occasion, and popped the cork. I poured the golden liquid into a crystal flute, the bubbles sparkling in the moonlight. I took a long, slow sip. The taste was absolutely magnificent. The parasites had finally exploded. The infection was completely eradicated, and my beautiful, hard-earned sanctuary was finally, unconditionally mine again. Thank you so much for listening to today's story. We hope you enjoyed it. As an ad-free channel, your support is what keeps us alive. Please support Violet Revenge Stories with just $1 via the QR code on the screen, or click the link in the description box or pinned comment. Also, we'd love to connect with you. Please leave a comment telling us which city or state you're listening from. Thank you for standing with us, and see you in the next stories.